Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. So, this is a story that I've kept to myself for the most part. Really, only a few close family members have ever heard it. My father told it to me, and the way he told it, his hands would shake, and his eyes would seem to see through time and space. This ain't your typical creature encounter story, I warn you. It was back in '68, deep in the jungles of Vietnam. My old man was a soldier, a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed private shipped off from our small Kentucky ranch to that humid hell, half a world away. He was with the 101st Airborne Division, stationed at this forward outpost that was more of a mud pit with tents than an actual base. Now, Dad was a dutiful man, never one to shirk responsibility, and he took to military life as best he could. What he didn't much care for was being so far away from home. I think he missed the green fields and the clear creeks of Kentucky. Sure, Vietnam was different, you know. One teeming with danger, real and present. Anyway, before the whole shit show, the day had been relatively calm. The guys were doing what they usually did, smoking, cleaning their weapons, or playing cards. Dad and his buddies, Hank and John, were having a break, huddled around a wooden crate they used as a makeshift table. All seasoned soldiers, they were slapping down cards and swapping stories from home. Hank was from Wisconsin, a dairy farmer's kid. John was from New York, son of a dock worker, city boy through and through. They were all different, but they became brothers in that wet jungle. They laughed, they fought, they bled together. That was the basic rhythm of their existence before the incident. Just regular GIs trying to keep sane in the chaos of war. Speaking of war, the combat ops were brutal too. They'd patrol during the day, maneuver through the foliage, crossing narrow streams and hike up steep inclines, all while watching out for the enemy. But their most dreaded part was the night ops. No one liked the jungle at night, Dad always emphasized. It was too quiet, too alive, too unforgiving. And then came the night that changed everything. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavy, and there was an almost eerie stillness in the atmosphere. There were a couple of platoons tasked with venturing out for a standard recon. Dad and his close-knit group were among them. Their objective was to move in deeper into the woods, monitor the enemy movement, and return to the outpost by sunrise. With night vision lenses over their eyes, M16s gripped tight, they headed out. Each step they took deeper into the jungle, bathing them in a deeper layer of obsidian black and an oppressive silence. It was as if the jungle was holding its breath, waiting for some unseen shoe to drop. Even the insects had quieted down, creating an unnatural vacuum of sound. They moved cautiously, the darkness almost a physical barrier, the oppressive humidity sticking their clothes to their bodies. Despite the best efforts, a sense of unease had started to creep in. It was like they were being watched, but by what, they couldn't tell. There was just this prickle on the back of their necks, a cold sensation worming its way down their spines, and no one could shake off the impending sense of doom. As they moved further into the belly of the jungle, the air seemed to get denser, and the familiar natural sounds of nighttime were missing. It was like everything else living had just decided to turn tail and hide. The only sound they heard was their labored breaths, the squelching of their boots sinking into the mud, and the occasional unexplained rustle of leaves. And then, without warning, it happened. Something moved in the darkness. A sudden flash of movement registered in the corner of their eyes, followed by an ear-piercing, bone-rattling roar echoing around them. The menacing roar shook them to their bones, and their breath hitched in their throats. Fear is a potent thing, and right then, it injected its icy venom straight into their hearts. Without a word, they turned towards the source of the sound. My dad's hand tightened around the butt of his M16. His heart pounded against his ribcage, but he swallowed back the lump of dread clutching at his throat. Now my dad, he'd seen a lot in the Nam. He'd looked into the eyes of a man he'd just shot dead. He'd held his buddy as he bled out, chanting half-forgotten prayers. He'd seen things that had hardened him to the harsh realities of life and death. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he saw next. Out of the blackness, something emerged. It towered above them, standing at least 8 feet tall, with a bulk that screamed of raw primal power. Its reptilian skin, smooth and scaly, glinted in the ambient low light, shadowy and terrifyingly real. It was nothing like they had ever seen. A feature that made it stand out was its eyes piercing yellow, glowing menacingly in the dark like sinister beacons. Its massive clawed hands flexed menacingly, scraping the trunks of the trees, the sound grating and chilling. It moved with a strange agility that belied its massive size, circling them as if sizing them up. My dad said its gaze felt calculating, like a predator contemplating its prey. The men were frozen as the creature observed its predatory gaze sent a wave of visceral fear through them. The world plunged into a deadly game of predator and prey. All my dad and the others could do was hope and pray. And then it struck, fast, savage. 4 men went down before they could even aim their rifles at it. It was like trying to fight shadows. Their bullets just whistled through the darkness, completely missing the creature. The jungle erupted into a cacophony of gunfire and guttural roars as they fell back, leaving their fallen soldiers behind. They ran for what seemed like hours, stumbling through the underbrush until they reached their outpost. The men who went out jovial and confident came back haunted and broken. They had entered the jungle as soldiers, but they returned as survivors. They didn't talk about it, not then. What could they say? They'd encountered something that defied all logic, all understanding. The incident was written off as an ambush, and they were commended for getting as many men back alive. But they all bore the scar of that night. Dad told me he spent many nights afterward, staring into the darkness, the echoes of his past haunting him. He wondered about what they had encountered that night, wondered about the men they'd left behind. With tangible pain in his eyes, he told me that what they saw that night was pure evil. It was cunning, ruthless, and utterly remorseful. It was the embodiment of the chaotic and cutthroat symphony of the jungle at night. He didn't talk about this for a long time. He hated remembering the death, the fear. It took him a while to even admit to himself what they'd seen that night. He never found out what it was, tried to forget. But you can't really forget something like that, can you? It stays with you, a shadow cast over your life, always just out of sight, always remembered. And that's my old man's story, a wild tale of a soldier's encounter with the unknown and the painful scars it left. I forget a lot of things, small things mostly. The big things, the really important things, I never forget. I remember the shoes my wife was wearing on our first date. I remember the name of the doctor who delivered our child. I remember those things. For the most part, they're all good. They're all happy memories. I guess that speaks to the quality of my life, huh? I shouldn't complain, and normally I don't. There is one memory, though, from a time before all that happiness, that I've never been able to shake. I'd forget it if I could, but it's important, so we don't really get to decide which memories we keep, do we? I was camping in the backyard of my grandparents' property. They owned a few acres just outside of town, and turning all that land into my personal getaway was a highlight of my teen years. I'd fish at their little pond. I'd invite a few friends if I was in the partying mood. On this particular night, I was alone. I was stargazing, out there away from the city lights, looking up at the night sky. That's as close to peace as you can get. I knew it even back then. I drifted asleep on the blanket I'd rolled out. That often happened. I'd wake up with a few bug bites, but I was never worse for wear. This time I woke up early. I didn't open my eyes to the light of the dawn. I didn't roll over into a face full of morning dew. It couldn't have been later than 3 a.m. Something was howling. I grabbed my flashlight and cut the beam across the land. My free hand was already shakily searching for the pepper spray that I knew was somewhere close. I always kept it nearby, even if my grandparents never had issues with bears or coyotes. But my light didn't land on a coyote. It landed on the naked back of a man. He was emaciated. I could count the ridges on his spine. He was facing away from me at first, hunched over something that he tore at with his hands. I didn't say a word. How could I? What I was seeing was worse than any wild animal. Animals had behavior patterns. You could predict things about them. Men, especially men looking like the one I saw, were unpredictable. But then I saw him change. I saw him change and I couldn't stop myself from screaming. At first, it looked like his spine was wriggling underneath his skin. It jerked and curled and pushed up against his flesh. His shoulders hunched, and his hands slapped the ground. Then the fur started sprouting. It was like watching the time-lapse of a growing seed. The dark strands poked up from his skin and grew into a thick forest. When my screaming startled him, he whipped around. His face was no longer human. It was canine. If I hadn't known any better, I would have thought the thing in front of me was just a dog. A sick dog, but a dog surely. Yet I'd just seen it transform. Its eyes were still human. They looked back at me with a sadness at first, as if the creature was maybe embarrassed. Then its gaze was angry. I'd seen something I shouldn't have. It was going to make me pay. It was on me in a second. I could barely backpedal out of its reach. I was still on all fours and I watched its long claws carve through my blanket with ease. It roared. I sprayed it in the face with my pepper spray. It yowled and recoiled, and I knew that was my only chance to run. I got to my feet and sprinted for my grandparents' home. It was further than I remembered. With every step, I was praying that the front door would be unlocked. If I had to fumble with my key, I'd be done for. I'm sure my grandparents feared it too. That's probably why. I sprinted, panted. I ignored the painful white-hot stitch in my side. I risked a glance back toward the monster. It was done pawing at its eyes. It was glaring back at me again. Then it was running. God, it was running. It tore across the earth like a machine. The rumble in its chest may as well have been a screaming engine. It shredded the ground, kicked up the grass and dirt, and it closed in on me with ease. But I was already on the front porch. I was already wrapping my fingers around the door handle. Then I burst inside. I crashed onto my face and forearms. I turned around wildly and kicked the door shut. The beast didn't have time to slow down. It slammed into the door. I heard it crumple against the solid wood. I scrambled as quickly as I could, turning the latch as it started to rake its claws against the frame. It spit and cackled and made sounds no animal should make. The ruckus woke my grandparents, of course. My grandfather fired a rifle through the door 3 times. That quieted the monster down. We peeked through the windows. We opened the front door. It was gone, of course. It was smart enough to know that it couldn't contend with a bullet. It was a long time before I slept outside again. The nightmares were pretty consistent. They were unforgiving. Sometimes it felt like the moment I closed my eyes, I'd be back in that chase. I wasn't sure that I could escape the monster every time. I'm sure my grandparents feared it too. That's probably why we never talked about it. Although I did catch my grandfather peeking through the windows whenever the night got dark. Eventually, I got brave. Eventually, I laid down beneath those stars again. I haven't seen the creature since, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten it. I always remember the important things. In the back half of my life, that means carrying a gun when I'm outside. I don't know if this counts as a cryptid encounter or not, but it was definitely something far beyond the normal scope of modern zoology. That's for sure. I was on a kayaking trip in Eastern Virginia. My route was about 30 miles, but that didn't take as long as you'd think with how fast the water was moving. It was only a 2-day, 1-night trip. I parked my car at the end point of my route and had a friend drop me off upriver that morning. I'm pretty experienced with a kayak, but that was my first solo trip. And after what I ran into out there, it landlocked me for about 5 years. I wouldn't even go into a swimming pool. The area I was kayaking was fairly remote. It wasn't dangerous country by any means, but it wasn't easily accessible, even by foot. The forests around that area are thick, and the underbrush makes it difficult to hike unless you are on groomed trails, which there weren't many of. Funnily enough, the landscape would seem a prime location for a Bigfoot sighting, but that isn't the creature I saw. Most of my trip was going according to plan. I did get hung up on a fallen tree and took on some water before I was able to free my boat. But things like that happen, and I just dumped the water out when I stopped for lunch and went on my way. I was on the water a little longer the first day than I had planned. I made good time, but it was around sunset before I stopped to make camp. I remember seeing something moving under the water as I beached my boat and drug it up onto shore. It didn't make a splash, and I couldn't get a good view of what it was before it headed for the safety of deeper water. I knew for sure it wasn't a fish. We have a type of large aquatic salamander called a hellbender that is native to the area. They can get pretty big, about 5 pounds, but sightings are rare. If you are lucky enough to see one in the wild, it is a sign the river is doing well. They typically hang out in shallow water and hide around large rocks. They pose no threat to humans. I didn't think too much about the creature and started setting up camp for the night and started my dinner. It was nearly dark by that point, but the moon was full and reflected off the river, casting a faint blue glow across the landscape. There was a slight breeze that night, and the only sound across the entire valley was the wind in the leaves. That was one of the reasons I love spending my time in the outdoors. It was so nice to get away and enjoy the silence. I had done a lot of camping up to that point. I always stored my food away from camp and washed up before settling in for the night, making sure not to draw the attention of hungry wildlife. I'll admit, bears do make me nervous, but I never had any problems with them before. I stored my food in a dry sack and hung it in a tree about 100 yards away from my tent. I could see the tree from camp, but just barely. I watched the sun set below the water, and I thought I saw something moving along the surface. At first, I thought it must be a waterlogged branch or tree that had fallen into the water. It was getting dark, so I couldn't see it well. I stared at it, trying to focus my eyes. Suddenly, it moved again. It was like a giant snake, or if I didn't know better, I'd say it was a sea serpent. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. They had to be. There were no sea serpents in the rivers of Virginia. I had a long day on the river, so with that thought, I got ready for bed. I drifted off to sleep without another thought of what was in the river, but the mystery would soon come knocking at my door. I was awoken in the night to the sound of something sniffing at my tent. I could hear the creature moving on the grass outside, but I couldn't hear footfalls. I thought the worst. I thought it was a bear. I stayed still and silent and prayed for the animal to move on. I didn't have any food in the tent. Nothing at all that smelled, not even a chapstick. The creature stayed at my camp for about 10 minutes before it decided there was nothing worth its time. I heard it bump into my kayak as it left. I stayed still in my tent for another 15 minutes before venturing out with a flashlight. There was no sign of the creature when I emerged. I searched the ground for footprints, but I couldn't make out anything discernible. I breathed a sigh of relief when I realized I was alone. But then I looked to the tree with my food hang. There was something wrapped around the base of the tree, and it looked like it was starting to climb. It looked like a giant snake from that distance. I was dumbfounded. We have snakes native to the area, but nothing like that. I left my camp to try to get a view of the creature. I had to know what it was. It seemed preoccupied with reaching my food bag, so I figured I was safe as long as I didn't get too close. I kept my distance out of cowardice, but I moved in close enough to see that it wasn't a snake that was climbing the tree. It was a salamander. It looked like a hellbender, but about 10 times the size. It must have been 12, maybe 15 feet long, and the middle of the creature was more akin to that of a snake than of a salamander. It was literally as if a sea serpent had grown legs and could walk on land. That's the only way I can describe it. I know it seems impossible, but I know what I saw. Unfortunately for me, the creature managed to reach my food and have itself an easy meal that night. I watched the entire thing happen, but I dared not confront the animal. It ate until it was satisfied, and then waddled down the embankment and disappeared beneath the water's surface. I can tell you one thing for certain, and it's that I was not at all thrilled about putting my boat back in the river that morning. The entire way back to my car, I was searching for signs of that thing. Luckily, I didn't see it again. My brain tells me that it must have been an unnaturally large hellbender. It's not unheard of for fish, salamanders, and turtles to grow to absurd sizes when food is plentiful and their habitat allows it. But then, how do I explain the creature's elongated body? Is this just something that happens when they grow to such a size? Or did I meet something else out there on the river? The heat had been something that year. Insufferable. It had been so hot that a person might do anything to escape the Texas sun. I know I was willing to do a lot. I was willing to agree to take a trip with my friends, a little excursion to the west of the town we all grew up in. I was even willing to help pitch our tents right along the riverbed, only to make our trek to the cool water that much shorter in the mornings. It was cold by the river, and we were thankful for that. It was even colder with the water up to your shins. And that was glorious. Walk far enough out and you might even find the tender current rising as high as your shoulders. We would have held our heads underwater for hours if we could have just to escape the sun. Lucky for us, the trees were gracious. The cedar and elm formed a ramshackle canopy, a poor imitation of a real jungle, but they did enough to filter out the sky's harshest rays. We thought we'd found a little weekend of heaven, but we could not have been more wrong. Between the four of us campers, there was a firefighter, a welder, an aspiring survivalist vlogger, and a line cook. Under normal circumstances, we could have thrived out there. We could have established our own little community and fallen off the grid if we felt like it. Circumstances became abnormal on the second night. While the rest of us retired, the firefighter opted for a late-night swim. None of us were particularly concerned, considering the river never flowed at a dangerous pace. After we zipped our tents shut, we heard some splashing. That was uncharacteristic of the firefighter. We listened, each of us isolated in our tents, when we heard a grunt and a sudden scream, and we simultaneously leapt to action. All three of us discovered that we weren't the type to be paralyzed by our fear in that very moment. Despite our quickness, when we emerged from our tents, the firefighter was gone. The river was still. The woods were quiet. We laughed and congratulated our friend on a prank well pulled. But he didn't come back. We waited. We searched the area as well as we could in the dark. Exhaustion was heavy in our bones by the time dawn started to arrive. It became easier to search the more light that we had. The survivalists found some tracks leading away from the water, so we all followed them. Funny enough, the tracks led to where we parked our vehicles. We all had a laugh as we made our way back to the road. We had set into a dire panic instead of considering that the firefighter had just gotten spooked and ran for the cars. We figured that he was probably still asleep in the back seat of his vehicle. But we were wrong about that too. His car was gone. He hadn't just been spooked, he had been terrified. He left his phone back at camp, incapable of calling the rest of us. Before we could finish scratching our heads, a branch snapped in the woods behind us. Something was moving in there. It was heavy. It had to have circled around us as we arrived on the road, cutting us off from our campsite, cutting us off from our gear, our keys. But we weren't worried, at least not yet. We were shaken up, sure. We were suspicious, but we didn't know what we were facing yet. Then, when a man walked out of the woods with a face like a dog's, fear swallowed us whole. The stranger was covered in fur, and there was wetness in its eyes. Spit dribbled from its fanged mouth. Its upright ears flicked in the wind, turned to chase the sounds of the woods around us. Those ears folded flat against its skull when the creature's eyes narrowed at us. This must have been what had chased our friend. We didn't blame him for running. The vlogger muttered and pointed out that his keys were still in his truck. We now had a chance to get out of there after all. So we took it. We broke into a sprint all at the same time. Us three and the monster. We all vaulted over the hood of my small car and flung open the doors to the vlogger's truck. We jumped inside. Two of us in the back seat, one up front. Up front, the vlogger got his door shut just before the beast arrived. The two of us in the back weren't so lucky. A clawed hand swiped for my leg as I got in. I pulled it back just in time. The creature was moving too fast to stop when it closed in on the truck. It crashed into the door, slamming its own limb in the jamb. When it recoiled to try a second time, we lunged forward and grabbed the handle. When the lock clicked, saving us all, it raked its long claws furiously against the glass. By then, the engine started, which made the creature flinch and jump back, clearing enough of a path for us to reverse and peel out of there. We left our other cars behind. We left everything behind. We found the firefighter at his house. He actually lived the closest. None of us said a word, all knowing that we'd all seen something that defied explanation. We stayed there for the night, and when the next day came, we went back for the cars. Whatever was left at the campsite stayed there. None of us wanted to go back in to gather anything. We'd had enough of a brush with a monster. We weren't going to open ourselves to a second encounter. It's been a few years now, and the story hasn't come up between us. None of us has told a soul, not as far as I can tell. I guess that makes you all the first, at least outside of our group. I'm sure you'll forget about it quicker than the rest of us. Unless maybe you've seen something too. Brockway Mountain Drive in Michigan is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I was in the service for almost 10 years. I saw a lot of the world, and still, that place between Copper Harbor and the Upson Lake Nature Sanctuary is one of the most beautiful. But on that day in December, the beauty was lost on me. My car was a mess. It was this rusted old coughing Ford Escort mini station wagon. It was on its last breath, but I really thought I could squeeze one more winter out from it. But as I rolled to the top of the Brockway Plateau just west of Copper Harbor, I had had enough. It died. It would not start, and it immediately got cold as all get out outside. I already had a rusted-out floorboard that caused snow and slush to spit up in my face while I was driving, and the passenger window was double-thick saran wrap duct taped together. When it died on the top of the hill, I took a minute and got out and had a smoke. I then prepared for the ritual. The ritual was me heaving to push the car down the hill and pop the clutch to get it started. Today, my hope was only to make it back home. I had to get a new car. The time had finally come. I put it in neutral and pushed the Escort to the edge of the plateau, and with the driver's door open, gave her one last shove and then jumped in. Down the hill I went. I popped the clutch, and for the first time, the damn thing did not turn over. It rolled to the lull at the bottom of the road and just stopped. Crap. Now I was stuck here until someone came along to give me a ride, and I had no idea how long that was going to be. And to make things worse, I was down to my last smoke. I did not even bother to push the Escort off the road. I was so pissed off I just sat there and lit up my last Marlboro. I was leaning back, cold as hell and facing west, looking at the snow, trees, and the tiny, unlined, patched up, pothole-ridden pavement when a giant animal walks dead center. It was about 200 yards away. I almost choked on my cigarette. I felt all the hair on my body standing straight up. I lived in the Upper Peninsula, and we got so used to things, we sometimes forget that we are in the wilderness up here. And what the hell was this thing? I remember thinking, oh my God, as it stopped in the middle of the road and just started casually walking towards me. It was so terrifying for so many reasons. It was big, and it was coming at me. I was alone in a car that would not start. I had no idea what the hell it was. I immediately started turning the ignition. Come on, come on, come on, I started screaming. I was about to get out and run back up to the hill to the plateau, to the east behind me. The same hill I just had rolled down, but to my shock, the Escort started. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I was so happy. Then, this crazy-looking walking dog started yelling and began charging at me on all fours like a bull galloping at me. I wheeled the Escort wagon around and puttered my way up the hill. I had already accepted death. That Escort wagon would not make it get away from a child on a big wheel. All I could do was floor it and hope I purred up the hill and made it over the peak to the other side, headed toward Copper Harbor. I was so thankful the car did not die on me. I looked back and saw the devil spawn standing on the top of the hill, all proud and boastful, howling and screaming. Please make it back to town, I kept saying. And I made it back to town. After that, I did get another car, but I never sold the Escort. I just could not part with her after she had saved my life from that dog man.